Hello, I'm Dan Gibson.
I'm Chad Dole.
And we're going to talk in this video a bit about the database that I started putting together many years ago and sort of how that developed and a bit about the database and what we can learn.
Yeah, Dan, I think a lot of people when they get introduced to your work, they're curious about how this all started because it's such a new idea, it's such a fresh idea, and it's something a lot of people haven't discussed before. So how did you happen upon this?
Well, I didn't go hunting for it. It's not something that I thought existed and I went out to find it. It's more just came from visiting mosques in the Middle East and having people tell me, just usually the guard who's there or the caretaker or whatever, and say, now this mosque doesn't face Mecca, this mosque faces Jerusalem. And I heard that multiple times in multiple places, and I began to wonder because I knew the traditional account, and I knew that really it was about a year and a half that once they reached Medina, and the first mosques were built in Medina, not in Mecca before that. They were built in Medina. And so how could all of these mosques in all of these places, some as far away as Oman, and how do I fit that into the story of they first faced Jerusalem? Because how can all these mosques be built in that 15 months? So as I started looking at it, just every time I would go to see an old mosque, or I'd like to go over, and then I asked questions, and I didn't have a tool, and it wasn't until about the year 2000 that I actually got a GPS tool. It was a handheld, simple tool, but it allowed me to make a simple measurement. All I wanted to know is what direction is this mosque facing. And that just started the very early things, just looking and trying to figure out how it worked.
Yeah, I can echo that. As an archaeology student, I had studied archaeology for a short while in the Middle East, and when we happened upon a certain mosque that seemed to be facing the wrong direction, my archaeology professor would just explain, oh, they're facing Jerusalem. And that was just the assumption, and we moved on. But what did you start to find as you started to gather these GPS coordinates with these mosques?
Some of them may have fit Jerusalem, but some of them didn't. They were just way off. And I thought, how could they get it so wrong? And so I began to plot them and look at it. Now, at the very same time, during those early years, I was taking archaeological students and professors and others to the city of Petra. That was just one of the things I did as a young guy. I was interested in archaeology, and the guy I worked with who was studying Arabic, and he had been an archaeologist, he would just give me the keys to his car and say, hey, my friends are coming, can you take them to Petra? So I just started making these trips. I enjoyed doing it, and I learned a lot from them, and I researched more, so I was more knowledgeable as I went. So I was very aware of the city of Petra, and I began to realize, I think some of these mosques are facing Petra. Now that was just a strange idea, and how do you prove it? Then this idea, and I think it came out of Patricia Crony, but others as well, started saying Islam began in northern Arabia. And I thought, well, that sort of appears what did happen. And so I remember one time I was teaching at a college in Holland, and I had free time every afternoon and every evening. I didn't have classes. Students hadn't written papers yet. So I went to the library because I hadn't brought anything extra to do. I had rushed to get there and then realized I had quite a few hours in the day. I picked up the book, Sirat Rasulullah. This is Guleman's story of Muhammad. And I thought, I'm going to read this through. I've looked at it, but I've never read it through. It's a big, thick book. But from beginning to as far in as I can get. And I'm going to think about a northern Arabian idea. And as I read it, the whole thing started to make sense. Like, no, this story took place in northern Arabia. I knew the geography. I'd been out there. And so I began to put the pieces together. But I didn't start really on the database till about 2009. I got a sabbatical, and I thought, I'm going to sit down and start to chart these things out. And I took time during my sabbatical to work on this project.
So it's fair to say then that this Northern Arabia theory, which had been worked on by other scholars, it's what really gave the context for you to understand the things you were seeing on the ground when you were collecting this Qibla data.
That's right, yeah, because the ideas were floating around, and I just thought, well, we can chart these mosques. We should be able to figure this out, because I knew some of them were too late, and they didn't fit into that window of just a year and a half. And so how do I explain that some of them years after that, like 20, 30, 40 years later, are not facing Mecca in Saudi Arabia? And then over time, that's when I realized, and I published the book, Quranic Geography, mostly for my friends, other people that I knew, to say, hey, look at what I found here. I didn't have a big enough database to actually pull out a lot of information. That only grew about the year 2017. I realized I had now over 100 mosques. I could sit down and really extrapolate data out of that. And that's when I discovered the Between Qibla. There were enough mosques, and then doing more research. Now I'm really interested in Qiblas. Yeah. So reading through things, I'm reading about Qiblas. I read through Al-Tabari from beginning to, three-quarters of the way through, because his later books are too late for my research. Yeah. But as I went through them, I was underlining anything that had to do with geography. So all the geographical points are underlined, and then highlighted anything that had to do with Qiblas. And I started doing that with other writings that I found. And sure enough, this Between Qibla really emerged, and it's a very powerful thing.
So in terms of your database, then, I'm curious, at what point did you sort of go from seeing, you may have a few misaligned mosques here, to seeing, this is a pattern? This is real.
That happened in 2010 during the sabbatical as I started charting these out. I remember telling my wife at the beginning, I said, I don't know what's going to come out of this. I said, maybe it's going to be some sort of, conspiracy theory kind of thing. Like, I don't know, but this is what it looks like. 4 months later, having charted everything out and gone through the internet and looking at everything I could find, I remember saying to my wife, this is not a conspiracy theory. There's enough evidence here. There's something going on here. This is not just looking at it and saying, well, maybe this is what happened. It's like, how do you explain the evidence? And that's it. It was concrete evidence that I was looking at.
And of course, today, Dan has a sample size of 278 places of prayer, mosques and other buildings which would have had a Qibla alignment. And that same pattern, it hasn't changed. It's gotten a little more complicated. You had mentioned, say, the parallel-facing mosque. How did you come upon that, and how did you start to process those mosques?
Well, quite early on, I recognized those, because there's a lot of them, and they're in North Africa. And right about the time that I was doing my research, a lot of companies were posting on the web maps of satellite imagery, and you could look down and look at things. And so I started searching for who's got the best imagery, and how can I measure things. And the North African mosques, they're big, huge mosques, many of them standing to this day. And you could just look right down at them and measure them and just go from one to the next and realize there's a pattern here that doesn't fit the other patterns. And that was a very obvious one for me. And since I was aware of Petra and Mecca, then the parallel one, because it looks like it's between these, that developed very, very early on in my thinking.
Yeah, and it's very clearly regional. It's Spain and North Africa, but it spans a wide range of time. So it's
and a lot of mosques. So the parallel one, I found over 40 mosques.
Right.
So that's a lot of mosques to be able to deal with, and just all the data, because they're all there and they're all in one place.
In the Middle East for a time, then, you could observe that there was a transition from Petra toward Mecca. But as you collected your database, you started to find a number of mosques which didn't really seem to decisively suit either. And what did you discover there?
Well, that came between some of the books I was writing, when suddenly discovering what I called the Between Mosque. And it wasn't until a few years later that I discovered that the first one, because I was always going back to say, well, who started this? where did this start? And I went back, and it's the Wasset Mosque, which means the between or
Yeah.
the middle. And it's like, oh my goodness, here it is. So I just called it the Between Mosque without realizing until I got back to the first one that that's what it was actually called, the Wasset Mosque. And so we have that whole group of Wasset mosques, again, over about 60 mosques that were all face that same Qibla, from north, south, east to west. They're all facing.
Yeah, a position between Petra and Mecca as perhaps a compromise. And what's exciting about this one, and I'm sure we'll get into it in a later video, is this is one of the few Qiblas where we have document evidence that the Wasit Qibla was one of the sins of Walid and his family, like one of the misdoings.
So the manuscript supports this. It's very interesting when you look at the Yamama Mosque. I'll pull that one out because it is between Petra and Mecca. It's down closer to Mecca, and it faces northwest up towards the between position. So, I mean, it should be facing way down this way, and it's facing there. It's built right in that time period. It's a between Qibla. You can see that, and it is between Petra and Mecca, where you could argue stuff in the north. Where exactly is it pointing? Maybe they didn't get it right. But this one here, it's rotated all the way around the other direction, and so it stands out very strongly and going, look, anybody who says they just messed up, they didn't just mess up.
Right, and it isn't 10 or 15 mosques you're talking about or places of prayer. There's 60 now you've confirmed that have adopted this between position.
Yeah, it's to me it's very, very strong.
And so what about the Mecca Qiblas? Like, did they come into being when you expected to find them, or what did you find there?
At first, I didn't know. I mean, we're hunting for mosques, and there's no database to go to. There's no place to go and say, here's the list. There wasn't a list. There wasn't a list on the internet, and nobody had produced a list of mosques. Therefore, the earliest one I could find was actually in Pakistan. So that was in my database, and it stood that way year after year after year.
Which is strange. Why so far?
And I said I don't know the beginning of the story because I don't think that mosque in Pakistan influenced the rest of the world. And it wasn't until I discovered a database of Syrian mosques. Because once I started making a database, other people started making a database. So that was followed by Israelis, that was followed then by Jordanians who made a database, and then out of Syria came more data. And so that's when I discovered the earliest mosque, and it was built by a caliph. It goes right back to Walid, same time as the other mosque, and realizing, okay, now we have a diversity. And that helped us put together the story of how the Petra mosques developed and how that fits, the Mecca mosques, where they started, and they started right after that second civil war, where the Kaaba had been moved and the Black Rock was moved, and it all fit together. The whole story fits together very nicely.
Yeah, and in Dan's new book, Let the Stones Speak, one of the major projects we're taking on is to try to provide a historical context to these shifts in Qiblas, which Dan has identified through his database, and provide context to it and describe how even this could be possible, because the compelling thing about this is the stones aren't lying. There's observable patterns, especially now that Dan has 278 places of prayer in his database. And it's funny, I'll walk into his office oftentimes and he'll tell me he just added another one. So
yep, they keep coming because people are out there, and I appreciate that. If you're listening and go, well, there's an old mosque out near where I live, go look it up and check the database. The database is online. If I don't have it, let me know. If you can, take a phone out there and check the GPS coordinates and send that to me. That's very helpful. I can look and say, because I may have looked at it in the past and missed it, as happened a few weeks ago. Somebody said, what about that? It was a qasr that was out there with the mosque in it, and what about that qasr? And I went to look, and sure enough, I had it listed in all the research I had done, but somehow it never gotten from the research into the database. So that was like, whoops, slipped up there. So I added another mosque into the database. Just 2 or 3 days ago, somebody wrote to me about a mosque, and I went back to check. And I had to send them a message back and said, thank you. It's not in my database because it's too late. It's several hundred years too late. I'm really looking at only the first 300 years of Islamic history, and then maybe a couple in the 400 or 500 year period if they are very unique, or if they, there's something about them that's, notable. Otherwise, by that time, everything was facing Mecca in Saudi Arabia. So please let me know and get back to me. And thanks, Chad, for all the questions. And
well, thanks for answering them.
I've enjoyed this.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, you take care. Bye-bye.